At dawn on March 6, 1944, Colonel Donald J. M. Blakeslee sat in the cockpit of a P-51B Mustang at RAF Debden in England, preparing to lead a mission the Luftwaffe had insisted was impossible, fighter-escorted American bombers striking Berlin, over 560 miles into the heart of Nazi Germany. German intelligence had long assured their commanders that no American single-engine fighter could reach Berlin and return. Up to that point, escorts like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning typically had to turn back hundreds of miles short of the capital. German fighter controllers waited just beyond escort range, then tore into the unprotected bomber streams. American losses in late 1943 had become unsustainable. The October 14, 1943 Second Schweinfurt raid, Black Thursday, cost the 8th Air Force 77 B-17s, about 26%. Earlier, on August 17, 1943, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, about 60 B-17s were lost. Daylight precision bombing was failing without continuous fighter cover. Blakeslee's P-51B had what the Germans didn't expect to see: long legs. Under each wing hung a 108-gallon British paper drop tank, fuel that, together with the Mustang's unusually generous internal capacity, about 184 gallons in the wings, later to 269 gallons total with the 85-gallon fuselage tank, gave it an escort radius up to 750-850 miles, enough to reach Berlin, fight briefly, and come home. There was a catch: with the fuselage tank full, the center of gravity shifted aft and the Mustang became pitch sensitive. Pilots were instructed to burn the fuselage tank first before maneuvering. Blakeslee, age 26, had been fighting since 1941, first with the RAF's Eagle squadrons, then with the USAF's 4th Fighter Group. He'd seen what happened when escorts had to turn back, Luftwaffe Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s massed just beyond the range line and mauled the bomber formations. Crews called it going naked. The P-51's path to Berlin began years earlier. In April 1940, the British approached North American Aviation to build P-40s under license. Company President James H. Dutch Kindleberger counteroffered a brand new design under Chief Engineer Edgar Schmude. The prototype flew in October 1940 as the NA-73, christened Mustang by the RAF. Early Allison engine Mustangs were superb at low altitude but lost performance above 15,000 feet, so the RAF used them mainly for reconnaissance and ground attack. In April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew a Mustang and recommended mating the airframe to the Merlin with a 2-stage supercharger. The result transformed the airplane. With the Packard-built Merlin V1650-3-7 in the P-51B divided by C, the Mustang became fast at high altitude, climbed well, and, crucially, could carry a lot of fuel efficiently. The 354th Fighter Group, 9th Air Force, took the P-51B into combat in December 1943, flying deep escort missions to France and Germany, including Kiel on December 13. Performance and range were finally sufficient to challenge the Luftwaffe deep over the Rhine. In January 1944, Lieutenant General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force and accelerated re-equipping fighter units with P-51s while changing tactics to aggressively seek and destroy German fighters. Blakeslee pushed hard to convert his 4th Fighter Group from P-47s to Mustangs and famously promised to be operational essentially overnight. Contemporary accounts support that the group flew combat in P-51s within about a day of receiving them at the end of February. With enough Mustangs now on hand, the 8th scheduled the first fighter-escorted daylight Berlin raid for early March. Weather scrubbed March 3. On March 4, 1944, the first attempt went in but most bombers were diverted by weather. Even so, the 4th Fighter Group is credited as the first to escort bombers to Berlin's airspace that day. 2 days later, on March 6, 1944, the US mounted the first large-scale daylight bombing of Berlin with continuous P-51 escort. Fighting was ferocious. The 8th Air Force lost about 69 bombers and 11 escort fighters. Some units later referred to March 6 as Black Monday. Despite the cost, the message was unmistakable: American single-engine fighters could now appear over Berlin. The Americans returned on March 8, striking the Erkner ball-bearing works in Berlin's suburbs. Aggressive tactics by P-51 leaders like Captain Don Gentile and Lieutenant John Godfrey showed that Mustangs could not only escort but dominate in combat over the capital. Gentile would finish the war credited with 19.83 aerial victories plus 6 on the ground, among the leading American aces in Europe. German fighter leaders grasped the implications immediately. Adolf Gauland urged pilots to press attacks on the bombers even if escorts were present, but the P-51s put themselves between the bombers and interceptors and forced combat on favorable terms. Experienced aces reported that Mustangs could stay with them in the turn and outpace them at altitude. Worse for the Luftwaffe, there were hundreds of P-51s, and more arriving every week. By April 1944, with long-range escort now routine, 8th Fighter Command expanded operations to fighter sweeps and strafing of Luftwaffe airfields ahead of the bomber streams. Losses on these low-level missions were not trivial, but the exchange rate devastated German strength on the ground. Fuel shortages mounted as synthetic fuel plants were bombed. Aircraft production continued, but trained pilots and gasoline became scarce. The strategic results were stark. Bomber loss rates fell from the crisis levels of late 1943 to less than 2% per mission in April 1944. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe managed only a handful of sorties over the invasion beaches against over 14,000 Allied sorties. The Allies had achieved air supremacy. The P-51's range and presence were central to that outcome. Through 1944, Blakeslee and the 4th Fighter Group kept pressing. He is often credited with 500-plus sorties and around 1,000 combat hours, figures frequently cited in biographies and unit histories, until higher command grounded him in October 1944 to preserve a proven leader. He returned to the U.S. in November. The 4th Fighter Group continued to add to its tally, ultimately becoming the highest-scoring American fighter group in the ETO with more than 1,000 confirmed aerial victories. Blakeslee later commanded in Korea and retired as a colonel in 1965, highly decorated. Behind every sortie were the ground crews. Crew chiefs and mechanics at Debden worked in all weather, pre-flighting at night, swapping engines in the rain, patching flak and cannon damage, loading .50 caliber belts by hand, fitting drop tanks, chasing leaks, and turning aircraft around to make the briefings take-off times. They knew delays could mean bombers flying without cover. Post-war interrogations captured the German view succinctly. Hermann Göring acknowledged that the appearance of long-range American fighters over Berlin meant the Luftwaffe could no longer protect critical targets in daylight. The strategic offensive could continue indefinitely, and Germany lacked the fuel, pilots, and time to stop it. In 1944, the U.S. Senate's Truman Committee called the Mustang the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. General Henry Hap Arnold described its arrival over Germany as one of the war's great miracles. General Karl Spaatz stated plainly that without the P-51, the strategic air offensive could not have succeeded. Bomber crews expressed it more simply: the Mustangs were their little friends. The P-51 didn't win through a tiny edge in speed or turn rate, it won through range, the ability to be there, over Berlin, over the Ruhr, over refineries and factories deep inside the Ruhr, then bring its pilots home. That lesson reshaped fighter design for decades. Combat radius became a central specification. Wars are decided by systems and by people. Engineers who blended an efficient airframe with a high-altitude supercharged Merlin, planners who built routes to stretch fuel, pilots who flew 6- and 7-hour missions, mechanics who kept tired machines combat-ready, factory workers who turned out nearly 18,000 Mustangs in 3 years, all combined to solve the range problem and change the air war's arithmetic. On those March days in 1944, Blakeslee and his pilots weren't setting out to make history. They were doing a job: find the enemy, shield the bombers, and get everyone home. History's verdict came afterward. Once P-51 circled over Berlin, the Luftwaffe had nowhere left to hide. The combined bomber offensive could bite deeply, air superiority was assured, and the path to victory in Western Europe opened.